Uh, um, okay, so thanks ever so much for the invite to come and speak to you today. It's a real pleasure to be here, so thank you very much. I realised that when I was asked to come and speak to you, it was part of your 100-year celebrations, which I think have been affected by COVID, as in everything else. And I realised that it's also very nearly 20 years to the day that I submitted my PhD to Cardiff. So it's a little anniversary of my own. And since then, I've been working on a whole range of different things, but I thought it would be nice to speak to you today about megaliths in particular, a lot of those in Wales. But this is something I've been interested in for a long period of time, essentially. And I have spoken to about these before, but we're making some considerable changes to our interpretation of these over the last few years. So I thought it might be interesting for you to see what we've been thinking about in the last few years. So before I talk to you about this, I do just want to acknowledge the fact that this is a joint project with my collaborator, Colin Richards, and I hope you can see him looking really happy and smiley here at this megalith just outside Dublin. So this is a joint project, and I'm going to be presenting the results of that. So I'm going to be talking to you today about megaliths, in particular dolmens, but just to set a little bit of a scene of all of that. These are Neolithic in date, and for some familiar things to sort of set them against, which is the Neolithic package, as we perhaps now refer to it. A whole series of different things: domesticated animals, domesticated crops, the first use of pottery, polished stone tools, and of course you'll all be familiar with the £1.52 stamp, which shows Grimes graves, so other practices like flint mining that show and indicate the start of the Neolithic in Britain and Ireland in the first instance. Now, when we're talking about the Neolithic, we often say that part and parcel of that Neolithic package is also the construction of monuments or megaliths. And this is a sort of a fairly typical image or series of images that we might associate with this Neolithic package and the start of the Neolithic in Britain and Ireland. This, of course, is West Kennet, and it's famously contained a series of human remains. And in fact, this is part of a series of what we would describe as chambered tombs, and they are quite various. They're found throughout different parts of Britain and Ireland, and the images that you can see on screen are fairly typical of the kinds of things that you'll see in books on the Neolithic, in particular the early Neolithic. So the key things that these monuments have are monumental architecture, but also significant quantities of human remains. And the image at the bottom left is a very famous image, and it evokes this idea of people going into these monuments, they're being deposited at the start of the early Neolithic, alongside all of these other practices that were introduced into Britain and Ireland at the start of the Neolithic. Now, coming on from that sort of general picture of what's going on in the Neolithic, we come out with a sort of a series of assumptions, I think. And the main image on here is a nice image, but it's quite a problematic image. It's quite a familiar scene. It's how people building houses, they've settled down, they've got cows in a field, they've got little garden plots of cereals. And they've now got time and effort and energy to construct a chambered tomb. And this is very much a sort of narrative that underpins a lot of our understandings of this particular period, particularly in Britain and Ireland. So far, so good. But there are a series of monuments that are known as chambered tombs that have a very uncomfortable relationship with that picture I've just painted. And here's just a few of them. These are all Welsh examples, but they're found much more widely than Wales. We'll have a look at a distribution of those in a moment. Now, one of the things about these sites is that they often adorn front covers of books. And I have, in a previous talk, actually tracked down all of the different books that have, in particular, Pentre Ivan on the front cover. Guilty myself, actually, of doing that. But these are very visual things. They often adorn the front covers of books, but yet they are rarely discussed in any real detail in relation to that view of the early Neolithic that I've just sort of painted for you. And the one on the top right, that's a little site called Carn Under in Pembrokeshire. These are very, very rarely discussed in the broader literature on the early Neolithic. People don't really know what to do with them. And part of the problem, I think, with some of these monuments is that they are a bit unusual. They have been described by somebody as typologically eccentric. And essentially people struggle to fit those into the Cotswold Seven style, the Orcadian style, the Clyde Cairns of Western Scotland, because they don't look anything like those other types of monument. So in Britain and Ireland, these are sites that are found in Western Britain, predominantly in Northern Ireland, but also down into the southwest of Ireland. They're not, sorry, southeast of Ireland. They're not really found in the southwest of Ireland. Getting my directions confused there. There are also a few down in Cornwall and just a couple down in the Medway area. So they're not found everywhere. They're predominantly a Western British phenomenon, a lot of them in Ireland, but they don't fit in with this other style of monument construction that is found much more widely and much more prolifically elsewhere in Britain and in Ireland. And those are the dots that don't make it into the red circle on that map. So, little bit more widely, these aren't sites that are exclusively found in Britain and Ireland. They are found in other parts of Northern Europe. And I've just sort of pulled up some images of those. These sites on the screen are in Ireland, they're in Denmark, and they're in Brittany. And I think it would be very difficult for the vast majority of Neolithic scholars to actually be able to say which was where. They look incredibly similar across a really broad area of Northwest Europe. And just so you know the answer, top left, we've got actually what looks very much like a Danish monument. That's actually an Irish monument. That's Carramore. The ones on the right are both Danish, and the one at the bottom where I'm looking up at it is in Brittany. So this is a wider form of architecture that's found in Northwest Europe in particular, lots and lots in southern Scandinavia, also into northern Germany, and also in France in particular. And this is where our project comes in, and that is what we're calling the Dolmen Project. Now, initially we started out looking at these monuments in Britain and Ireland, and we quickly realised that that wasn't sufficient to get to understand these. And we're calling it the Dolmen Project because in many parts of Britain and Ireland, these are known by a different name. So these examples, the upstanding examples, are all Welsh examples, and they're known in the literature as portal dolmens. And that's the emphasis there on the portal component, which on the plan you can see in the middle. That's the portal stones highlighted there. And just to sort of show you how that works, on the top right are just the portal stones surviving. That's a really interesting site up in North Wales, Cistcerrig, where you can see just the portal stones, and I've always thought ironically described door stone in the middle, which of course was no such thing, was never used as a door to gain entry. In the case of Cistcerrig, there's no other evidence of any other stones having been at that particular site. So this was the starting point really for what we were looking at. The name portal dolmens in Wales in particular, they're known as portal tombs over in Ireland, and if you go down to Cornwall, they're often known as cromlechs or quoits. And then when you go beyond Britain and Ireland, they actually have a whole series of other names. And dolmens, they are popularly known as dolmens in France, but they are always known as dolmens over in southern Scandinavia. So we felt that this was a good description to discuss this broader type of monument. So initially, we were very interested in particular aspects of these monuments. And I'm thinking this is, if you've ever heard me talking about dolmens, and I do from time to time, you may have heard me talking about this aspect of things. I won't spend very long on this and move on to some of the new ideas that we've had in relation to these sites. But when we started visiting a number of these sites, there was one thing that kept leaping out at us. And it wasn't the portal stones or the portal component of these particular monuments. So this is the wonderful chuncoit, which is often described as a mushroom down in Cornwall. And it has this very characteristic large capstone perched on top of the supporters. No real sign of portals in that traditional typological sense at this site. This is actually replicated, this large capstone, really across Northwest Europe. When we went over to Denmark, again, we were struck by how impressive these capstones were, lifted up and displayed like this. And this remains one of my favourite pictures of dolmens from the entire project, actually, which is a site in Ireland, in South Ireland in County Carlow. This is Brown's Hill, and it's the most fantastic site for a whole series of different reasons. You can see Colin looking up in amazement at this particular site. It is the biggest dolmen ever constructed in Northwest Europe. There are no other sites of this magnitude. The capstone at this site is estimated to weigh 160 tons, and in fact they failed to lift the rear end of it up. It's just propped up at the front. Frankly, the fact that they were able to do that, oh my god, that's my phone, I'm so sorry. Let me go and turn that off. Oh, the joys from working from home. Sorry. So this is 160 tons of stone lifted up, as you can see. Excuse me. My phone's ringing. I don't know if you can unplug it for me. Sorry, my phone never rings at home. So this particular monument is the largest capstone in Britain, in Ireland, in the whole of Northwest Europe. And the only stone that was larger, sorry, that's my cat now attempting to gain entry into the room, that was larger than this, that was moved in Neolithic, was the large stone at the Table de Marchand, which was about 300 tons. So it really is a remarkable site, and it indicates really the size and scale of this kind of architecture in the Neolithic. Now, it's not just a big stone that was required in these monuments, it was also about the presentation of these stones. And this is the iconic site Pentrefan in Pembrokeshire. And you can see that it's not just about lifting up a big stone, it's also about presenting that in a very specific way. So in this instance, you can see, sorry. Gosh, this is a disaster. It's never happened in all the time I've been lecturing to the students all semester. So in this instance, you can see that that very large capstone has been lifted up on a series of small points and displayed in a very particular way. And this is again a theme that's found more widely widely throughout northwest Europe. It's not just the British and Irish ones. Again, this famous site, the Table de Marchand, before, if you've been to this site, it's now reconstructed, it's covered with a gigantic cairn. At this site, before it had a cairn over it, you can see it's the same idea again. A big stone, in this instance, a component of a menhir, that's been just lifted up and displayed in a very particular way. So for myself and Colin, when we first started visiting these sites and looking at these different monuments, we were immediately struck by this large capstone. And we immediately started to think about these things not as monuments that were chambered tombs as they are understood in this broader narrative of the Neolithic, but as something completely different. So for us, this was the taking the chamber out of the chambered tombs. We argued that if you wanted to construct an area for deposition, this is not the kind of thing that you build. Pentre Van then there again, a really good example of how as a chamber this is pretty useless. And people are always saying, oh, well, there would be a bit of dry stone walling, they'd be covered with cairns. And yes, they would and could have been in those instances. But if you want to make a chambered tomb for deposition, have a look at what they're doing in the Cotswold Severn region, those ones we saw initially. And you'll see that that's a much better, easier and quicker way of achieving a chamber for a chambered tomb. So that's kind of at the starting point really for the rest of where we've gone with this particular project. The next thing we started thinking about really was where these monuments had come from. So we began to contemplate, were these sites that were quarried? And Colin himself had been working up on with the Ring of Brodgar up in Orkney, and had discovered that the stones in the Ring of Brodgar come from a whole series of different places in Orkney and were very carefully composed in that location. So we began to explore whether or not these was happening in the same way in the early Neolithic. We quickly realised that actually what was happening at dolmen sites was very, very different from what the kind of practices we're perhaps more familiar with from the late Neolithic. Sites like Stonehenge, where we know, again, stones being taken really long distances to construct those particular sites. These were quite clearly sites that were constructed more or less in situ. And the classic excavation really that demonstrates this was the site of Carrick Sampson in Pembrokeshire, excavated by Frances Lynch in the 1970s. And she discovered when she started digging around this particular monument that it actually sat in the pit from where the capstone itself had originally sat, much to her shock and horror, because she was essentially undercutting the monument, and if she carried on it would have fallen over. It's essentially a house of cards style effect. So the uprights are there and then the capstone is on top, keeping it all in place. And that capstone effectively has been in the ground. They've dug around it, they've lifted it up in situ and turned it into a dolmen. And you can quite clearly see that at a lot of other sites. This is a fantastic site in East Island, County Louth. And again, you can see that capstone there, that's a glacial erratic effectively, that's almost certainly was deposited at that location. They've excavated around it and lifted it up in situ. We then did some excavations in Pembrokeshire to start off with at this site, Garnturn, and we found the same type of evidence at this location. So this is another remarkable site. This is the largest capstone of any monument in Britain, in Pembrokeshire. This is a lightweight at 80 tonnes. You can see our excavation team there sitting on the short end of that capstone, but it's fallen over. The whole monument has gone crashing down, and we're pretty sure we've been able to demonstrate that fell over probably in the early to middle Bronze Age. So it was standing at one point, but it's gone crashing backwards in a moment of complete disaster. is actually two monuments. There's the main monument, there's another smaller monument here. And we think the thing that made this fall over was the addition of these rows of standing stones, which have been dated to the Bronze Age. So we think that the Bronze Age people have accidentally knocked over the dolmen when they've been putting up these other stones around it. Just to note that in the front of this, there is a large pit, and that we think is the place in which the capstone was extracted. And it was extracted, dug around it, lifted up in situ, and then it's gone crashing backwards. So really good evidence for this sort of thing happening. We excavated another site with less success, I should say, up on Anglesey. And this site was quite badly affected by more recent activity. It had been lived in the 18th century. But we did again at this particular site find again one of those big pits where people had been digging around a glacial erratic and then lifting it up in situ. So this kind of got us onto the thinking about what these landscapes would have really been like. So these are glacial erratics. People are turning glacial erratics into monuments. And actually the clue to what the landscapes would have looked like was back at that original site that we excavated in Pembrokeshire, Garn Turn. So I hope you can just see the monument there in the distance, just to the right of the tree. But actually surrounding this monument are still this huge scatter of glacial erratics that have been left in situ. They haven't been cleared by the farmer. And you can see behind, the fields behind those stones have all been cleared. And it's actually the field in which the monument is sitting is actually a much better representation of what a lot of the landscapes of Western Britain would have looked like in the Neolithic period. And this got us really interested in glacial erratics and how these dolmens sort of interacted with these particular natural features. And when we were out and about, very occasionally we would come across some of these kinds of erratics that you would find. Most of them have been cleared away. Most of them have been turned into field walls, into houses, into roads. And in fact, in Denmark, they estimate that potentially thousands and thousands and thousands of dolmens have actually been destroyed before they were able to be preserved, because there's no natural sources of stone in Denmark. And so the only thing they had to use were dolmens to effectively build their roads when they were putting in all of their infrastructure. So we kept occasionally coming across things like this, hints and tips of what a Neolithic landscape would have looked like. And also we came across from time to time very famous erratics that have attracted subsequent attention. And here's just a collection of these sort of famous erratics to sort of give you a sense of what these things might have looked like in the Neolithic. This is one that's close to me. This is the Bowder Stone up in Cumbria. It's a popular visitor attraction. This is another one with its own little ladder in Ireland, in County Wicklow. But perhaps the most instructive one of these is this site at the bottom, of which there is only a drawing, which is called the Tolman. It's down in, or was down in, Cornwall, and you can see that it was an attraction back in the 18th century. It was actually destroyed before unfortunately it could be preserved. But there was a great deal of discussion at the time about whether or not this was a natural thing or a humanly constructed thing, and they decided and concluded at the time that it was humanly constructed. It wasn't. It was actually a glacial erratic. And so really what we're thinking about when we talk about the early Neolithic, we often think about things like this. This is a lovely site on Funen in Denmark, of these lovely sort of dolmens sitting there surrounded by, in this instance, lovely cleared agricultural land. But this is absolutely fundamentally not what they would have looked like. This would have been just a dolmen in a landscape of many, many, many other stones. The vast majority of these have been cleared over the last 6,000 years, but perhaps this is the sort of thing that we might be thinking of. This is Kilclooney up in County Donegal in Ireland, and you can get a sense of how the dolmen sits amongst other types of stone in that particular landscape. Now, when we started to look into the environmental setting of these monuments to sort of add that extra layer again, again, a lot of the pictures I've shown you are of lovely cleared agricultural land. Time and again, when there are environmental sequences from dolmens, and I should say there aren't that many, but where the work has been done, it's almost always the case that the monument sits within woodland. And there again, there are a few examples of this surviving nowadays. This is not Neolithic, necessarily Neolithic style woodland, which would be, you know, oak, elm, lime, that kind of thing. But it does give you a sense of the kinds of settings of some of these, perhaps not quite as close as this, again, another example in Funen in Denmark, but certainly within close proximity of the monuments themselves. And we were lucky when, as part of this project, that the final monument that we actually investigated actually tied into a lot of these ideas and narratives that we were thinking about in terms of glacial erratics and woodland. And this is a site that we excavated in the Burren in County Cavan. Now, you'll all have heard of the Burren, and there is a Burren, there's actually two Burrens in Ireland. The famous Burren is the one with Pulna Brone on it. We weren't at that one. We were at the one in County Cavan, which is the lesser known of the two. It's smaller, but it's very, very similar. It's a series of upland limestone landscapes. And as I hope you can see on my map, it's an area where there are also quite a few dolmens. There's a little cluster just to the south of Loch Macneen in County Cavan. It's just on the border with County Fermanagh as well. So we went along initially just to have a look at the dolmens in this particular area. They're quite nice. They're fairly typical for dolmens in Ireland. The most famous example in that cluster is the Calf House. It's a bit knackered. The capstone's fallen down to one side and it's been turned into, you'll never guess, a house for keeping cattle in the 19th century. But what actually amazed us much more than this particular dolmen was that in the surrounding landscape, there were just so many surviving glacial erratics. When I was putting this together, I was having a look through all the pictures I'd taken. I've got about 200 pictures of glacial erratics in this landscape. They're absolutely fantastic. In fact, you can see that we ended up sort of almost recording them as if they were archaeological monuments, because they do have a lot of characteristics similar to dolmens. And this is just a peculiarity of the local landscape, which is a limestone landscape, and then the glacial erratics are a different lithology. And so the limestone erodes away quite rapidly through particularly rainfall, and these erratics are left almost standing proud on these little plinths of limestone underneath. So really quite an amazing and fantastic landscape, and also in trees, so that gives it that aspect I was talking about as well, although in this instance it's Scandinavian pine being grown. So this is the monument that we looked at. We didn't have a name, it just had a number in the Irish Monuments record, so we called it the Cleven Carrig, so the Cleven Stone. And you can see that it is the remains of a very large stone that's been split, actually not into two as it would appear in this picture, but into three chunks. So the largest chunk is stone A. It's been cleaven in half, and there's stone B there. And there's also a little bit off to the side. And we were given permission to excavate this site because we weren't quite sure really what it was. It may be, well, it clearly is a glacial erratic that's been brought in and dropped into this landscape, but it was unclear whether this was nearly a dolmen, going to be a dolmen, simply a stone that had happened to snap in half. There were some little hints and tips before we started, one of which was that there was rock art carved onto some of the surfaces of this stone that's cleaved in two. So we knew that there was human action there in prehistory. But we got permission to excavate around it. And we found, yes, quite clearly this is a monument or a site that people have been involved with. So we actually found two great big pits underneath the stone. This stone, this is stone A, has been propped up at one side, and you can see that hollow underneath it, but there's a similar hollow underneath the stone next to it. And essentially, what we think this is the remains of is a glacial erratic that's busy being prepared to be turned into probably a dolmen, but they've quit. They've quit at some point for whatever reason. Perhaps it was bad fortune, perhaps the person sponsoring it was no longer able to complete it. But we think that this is a monument on its way to being a dolmen, but has failed in the execution. So it's a really, really interesting landscape. The other thing that struck us is that this is the kind of thing that simply wouldn't survive in the archaeological record into the modern day because it's not finished. It may be the case that there were many dolmens that were unsuccessful, that weren't completed, that fell down, and they of course would be cleared away with all of the other glacial erratics in the landscape. However, this site and this area began to move us on to the next thing that we've been thinking about in relation to these monuments, which is how people would have encountered these landscapes. So very much in terms of not just these glacial erratics lying around, surrounded perhaps by woodland. So that sort of thing, this is about as close as we can get to envisaging what these might have looked like, a Swedish and Danish example there. But how encounters would potentially be very carefully orchestrated in the early Neolithic. And it's one site that we kept coming back to. In fact, we visited it many, many times because it was completely perplexing in so many different ways. And it's this site, Ackna Cliff in County Long, middle of Ireland. It's perplexing in a whole variety of different ways. The first thing is it is a dolmen of some description, but it clearly doesn't have a portal in the traditional sense of the word. It clearly does not create any sort of chamber. It's just this weird stack of stones. And you can see Colin there looking up at it, pondering what on earth to make of this particular monument. What was even more perplexing about it was that it was really hard to find. And in fact, you could drive past it from about 200 meters and you couldn't tell it was there. And in fact, when we first tried to visit it, we ended up over at this house saying, how do we get to this particular monument? And we'd approached it from the wrong direction. And there's a little stream valley running between the house and the monument. We had to come at it the other way. And coming at the monument from the other way, it was more or less invisible until about 200 meters away. And then all of a sudden, it appeared in the field in front of us. An absolutely amazing. And just to show you another image of that, this is the way in which we're envisaging people approaching this particular monument, perhaps along the stream valley. And there it is in all its kind of crazy dolmen majesty in front of us. And you can just see how this in no way is a chambered tomb in the traditional sense of the word. And this led us on to think about the types of encounter and what people in the Neolithic were trying to achieve when they were creating these monuments, surrounded by glacial erratics, often hidden away in the woodland. And we began to think that this was actually all about presenting monuments in a very specific, orchestrated fashion. It wasn't just walking up to a monument like we do nowadays and seeing it from afar and walking up to it. It was very, very carefully orchestrated. And the only thing that we could think about in terms of coming across monuments like this in a Neolithic world was all about creating a sense of wonder on us looking at monuments, agog at what we were seeing, and truly visiting sites like Browns Hill, the site with the capstone of 160 ton 160 tons. We saw plenty of tourists walk up to it looking exactly like that. They couldn't quite believe what they were seeing. I've put the image on the right up as a bit of a reference because the notion of wonder really has a sort of a long-term reference or relevance in archaeology. This is Carnarvon and opening up the Tutankhamun tomb, and he says to Howard Carter when he opens up Tutankhamun's tomb, "What can you see inside?" And Howard Carter replies, "Wondrous things." So this is the kind of thing that we're perhaps familiar with in archaeology, this notion of wondrous things. But actually the notion of wonder hasn't really been explored in relation to the archaeological record in anything other than a sort of a passing comment. And so we've been looking into this notion of wonder, and what's quite extraordinary about it is it seems to be something that is in actual fact universal to humans in all varieties of cultural contexts. They have a word and a name and an understanding of this concept of wonder. And there is a good book on this by Vassalou in 2013, and she writes that when confronted with something or extraordinary beheld or experienced for the first time, that is something that is wondrous. And this has led us to think that dolmens are objects of wonder. They're there to elicit an emotional response, oh my goodness, look at that, isn't it amazing? And of course, in a Neolithic context, that would be very much in the realm of the magical or the religious. And again, Chris Gosden has been writing some really interesting things recently about magic and how that again translates cross-culturally into a variety of different contexts, but very, very significant for prehistoric populations. So the other key aspect of wonder, so wonder and awe, is almost always accompanied by an element of fear, and it functions to diminish oneself in relation to that which is perceived as vast. Well, I think we can all agree that these were the biggest stones, the vastest stones being selected in the Neolithic to be turned into these particular monuments. It certainly starts to explain better the kinds of monuments like Brown's Hill here, other than the traditional narrative of these simply being chambers for receiving the remains of the dead. So our suggestion is that the power of the dolmen isn't in the nature of the stone itself. These were landscapes filled with these stones. These stones were literally everywhere in the early Neolithic world, but it's how those are presented that are different from the ordinary and the familiar in these new peculiar things that they've called, what we now call dolmens. And an element and an aspect of that was their vastness, so that it's presented in a way literally that you come across it. Perhaps you can't see it until you're very close to it. It's surrounded by trees, but you walk up to it, it's revealed in all its glory and splendor in front of you, and you are literally having a wondrous, magical, religious experience. And just to sort of show you, this works really with a whole series of different sites across the northwest of Europe, these sites which are described as typologically eccentric, except they're not. They fit perfectly with this idea of a wondrous and magical encounter. So this is us. We've taken the chamber out of these chambered tombs, and now we've taken the tomb out of these chambered tombs as well, because we are arguing that these essentially were not constructed with any real thought to these being used for the disposal of the remains of the dead. There's a however. There's always a however. Sometimes when these sites are excavated, we do find the remains of people in them. This is the site of Poulnabrone on the more famous Burren, and this was a site that was excavated. It's a very popular tourist destination, and it was excavated really to just sort of smarten it up. A bit had fallen off, and they wanted to tidy it up so that it could be reopened to the public. They didn't think for a minute that they would find anything in it. Anne Lynch excavated this, and she says, she thought it was going to be a very short job when they started excavating it. And directly underneath the layer of Coke cans and crisp packets, they found a whole series of human remains in situ. So clearly some of these monuments were used for the disposal of human remains. And the critical thing here is that it appears that whole bodies were going into these monuments. And you can see that little quote there, that's from the excavation report of Pulnabrone, that clearly some of the bones were articulated and they were therefore going in with their flesh on them into the monument at a particular time. So I've hopefully tried to persuade you all that these aren't chambered tombs at all, and yet suddenly they're being used as if they are chambered tombs. And this is really where some of the stuff that Colin has been thinking about comes into play. And he has a favourite book, which he talks about at length when we're out and about dolmening. This is The Third Policeman. And this is a strange tale, because in this novel, people and things live in a relational world. And if you read this quote, you will see that they are talking about the atomic theory. And towards the bottom, the sergeant, it says, Michael Gilhaney is an example of a man that is nearly banjaxed from the principle of the atomic theory. Would it astonish you to hear that he is nearly half a bicycle? And the problem here is that this man has been sitting on the bicycle, cycling around, and some of the bicycle, the nature of the bicycle has flowed into him and vice versa. And of course, the answer is it would surprise me unconditionally to find out that that's what was going on. So the idea of this is that things aren't bounded entities, but actually can flow between different things. And actually, although Colin often refers to this novel, it's not an unfamiliar concept in prehistory. We've talked for many years about partable persons and the nature of personhood and the bounded or non-bounded nature of material culture and materiality. So it just ties into those broader narratives and broader interpretive ways of understanding the material world that have been popular for the last 15 or 20 years. So the question is, if this was what's happening, what might we expect to find in relation to the early Neolithic? Are there hints and tips that might suggest that this flow of substances might be something that was going on in the early Neolithic? And so the thing that we might be concerned about is that if that's the case, you clearly don't want men turning into bicycles and bicycles turning into men, or the two moving between those two different substances. What you want to do is you want to make sure your surfaces are intact. Things need controlling. You can't have things leaking and oozing across these different states. And of course, if we look at broader Neolithic material culture, this is exactly the kind of thing we find. So, for example, a lot of energy and effort spent on the surface or the skin of early Neolithic pottery. Again, early Neolithic archaeologists perpetually perplexed by why people spend so much time polishing stone axes. Yes, it makes them slightly better at cutting things down, but clearly if we understand the world in this sort of fluid and relational way, actually this may all be about creating a skin, a surface, which can't then flow into or enable flows of things between different items, people and objects. And in fact, when we look beyond beyond material culture into other forms of monumentality, we also see things like causewayed enclosures, where again a series of skins, if you like, bind the interior of this particular form of monument. So plenty, I think, of hints and tips that this might be the kind of situation that we're envisaging in the early Neolithic, a worry and concern about the flow of substances from one thing into another. Now, when we come to look at dolmens, we spent a lot of time spending happily looking at the capstones. One of the other things that we've noticed, again, this is universal, whether you're in Brittany, whether you're up in southern Scandinavia, whether you're in Ireland or the west of Wales, is that dolmens always have a cleaved inner surface. And that's the inner surfaces of both the uprights, but also a cleaved underside to the capstone. And what that enables, in contrast to those nice skins on the outside of the dolmen, which is the natural surface, is that that's a surface which enables absorption. And this, we think, is where or why we find human remains in these monuments. So at sites like Poulnabrone, bodies are going in fleshed, they're going in whole, and then they start to decay. And our argument is that that enables the flow of the flesh into the monument itself through those cleaven surfaces. It's the opposite of the outside of the monument, which wouldn't enable that particular effect to happen. And with this, we're arguing, is a process of reanimation. It is, of course, something that that changes both entities in that relationship. It reanimates the monument, but at the same time, a component of the people going into it also changes. And we think that this is probably something to do with descent, the descent of people who were originally building these monuments in the first place. So I think what we're envisaging is that these monuments were constructed to elicit ideas of awe and wonder, a very specific encounter, a very specific magical response. But of course, after you've come across these things a few times, that perhaps starts to ebb away, and then you need to reanimate that process, add something else to it. And that's why we think that these bodies were going into these monuments after a certain period of time. However, it's a finite process. You can't keep chucking bodies in. At a certain point, that reanimating process would finish. And essentially, that's the point in which these monuments fall out of use. And that seems to be very roughly the middle Neolithic. There doesn't seem to be very much going on at these sites after that particular point. However, it's also worth noting that in the Bronze Age, they seem to then come back and potentially reactivate these sites and reuse them. So perhaps this is a process or a way of doing things that has resonance beyond just the early Neolithic. So just to pull all of these together, are these then really chamber tombs? Are these really part and parcel of that Neolithic package in the traditional sense of the concept of a chambered tomb? We're arguing not. I mean, they're clearly understood alongside those monuments, but we think that they're of a different order than things like West Kennet or Cotswold 7 chambered tombs. Instead, the deployment of these gigantic capstones in many instances is all about creating wondrous encounters, religious experiences, really in the realm of the magical and the fantastic for people in the early Neolithic. That only worked for a certain period of time. And after that, people were needing a different approach to come back and reanimate these monuments through the deposition of human remains. And that, of course, is why they're known as, still in the literature, as chambered tombs. So many thanks for inviting me to speak. And again, just to acknowledge Colin in all of this, and a shameless book plug, the book on all of this is out very soon in all good booksellers in 2021. So thanks very much.
Thank you very much, Vicki, for that very stimulating talk, which made us rethink, whether these chambered tombs are in fact tombs, which is a good question, and you seem to answer yes and no to that question, which is a nice form of ambiguity. I think so. It's up to me to invite questions. I'm sure Neil has a question, but no, you don't. Gosh. I was going to say, can someone maybe else ask a question, and maybe just put your hand up if you want to put a question to Vicki?
In the short term, I'm going to apologise very much for my phone going off, which, in all honesty, hasn't rung in about 2 months. So it really was quite a surprise to.
Okay, I think there's some things in the chat, so there may be some questions in the chat.
I was just me saying that dolmening is an excellent word.
Some people have to go, but is there a question?
I'll go for one then. So when you were saying about it kind of being an addition almost, that we find burials within these monuments, Does that play into what you were saying about the flow and change, the fluidity of these boundaries, and that it's at that point that maybe it flows into becoming something else, and that's when that monument in itself may change? Is that a fair interpretation?
Yeah, it's a chicken and egg question again, though, isn't it? Because clearly this kind of thing is anticipated, I think. So they're not. I don't think they're going in and cleaving those surfaces subsequently. So I think there's an anticipation, perhaps, that you might need to do this sort of thing. But I think certainly in the first instance, we're suggesting that the monument in and of itself is nothing to do with burial, but the flow of substances comes later on, and that fundamentally changes the thing itself, which is the dolmen, from being this thing of wonder into something completely different. And at the same time changing the people who are going into the monument. Perhaps they are transitioning from being dead into ancestors or named descent groups for particular people building that monument. So yes, I think it's all about the subtleties of the temporality of the construction and subsequent use as we would have it. It's perhaps just reconceptualizing all of that.
I've even changed my profile picture in you can play.
Is Julia, is she finished speaking? I'm not quite sure.
Yeah. I'm finished.
Anyone? Any other questions?
I don't think.
Tim.
Oh, sorry. Go ahead, Neil. You started.
Well, I was going to say. I mean, I think that. Well, I did remember reading Colin's discussion of this fluid thing and finding it completely unconvincing. I have to say. He said that he was very happy to have all my rude comments, but he was going to pay not the blind bit of attention to any of them, which sounds about right for Colin. But I don't see how it works in your logic when you're saying that they're all cleaving stones specifically. I mean, there's no reason why a stone would be notionally absorbing from one direction or another direction. I don't see how the logic in the argument about how by cleaving a stone you're supposed to be making it absorbent from one direction and not another direction. I just don't see the logic in that argument. And I also don't see the logic in the argument that these are two separate phases of construction, in the sense that two separate phases of use of portal dolmens, because, you know, if portal dolmens all do have cleaving stones, which I'm not convinced that they all do, you know, then they must have thought of this before, and there must be a reason for doing that. So I think there's a illogicality in that argument.
Mm-hmm. Well, I suppose it's quite reassuring that you don't like it. So I would expect nothing else apart from some good critical thought in relation to this idea. I think we came about it when we kept coming across these cleaving surfaces that are on the inside of the monument, and we couldn't really think what else that was for. There was no, why not on the outside? Why always on the inside? And why the underside of the capstone was also almost always either cleaven or pecked. We actually found people deliberately taking bits off. The site we excavated, Garn-Turn, there were huge quantities of the underside of the capstone just in the pit. We couldn't sort of make head nor tail of this, and I think it's when the contradiction was, if these aren't chambered tombs, which we'd been arguing for, and of course if you think they're chambered tombs, then it's not a problem, but we've been arguing that they're all about a display of this big stone. Then why go to all this bother and effort of having these cleaving surfaces? And also, why do some of them have human remains in them? So it seemed to be a contradiction, and this was our interpretation of how that might work. But, you know, it's the Neolithic. There's plenty of other possible alternatives to that. The only thing I would say is there is no logical reason for popping 160 ton of stone on top of your chamber if it is just a box to keep dead people in. It seems overkill.
But there's nobody ever said that chamber tombs are logical or simple. I mean that's an illogical argument, because nobody thinks any chamber tomb is a logical way of storing your dead body. You know, it's just not. you know, the aspect is monumentality. So nobody's disputing the fact that chamber tombs are always about a monument and always in some sense about wonder and awe. So I wouldn't dispute that. But that doesn't, you know, that doesn't say, that's not a reason for saying they're not chamber tombs, just because I could completely accept all your argument about raising up the stone, propping them up, and how that's a very special aspect to these monuments. But it wouldn't stop me believing that they were chamber tombs, because they're, and that an important part about them was for containing human remains right from the beginning, because I just don't see that as mutually contradictory. I mean, that's assuming that a monument only has one purpose, which again seems to me a kind of very narrow way of looking at monumentality. I think the monuments are multi something or other, and so there's lots of potential. Anyway, Hannah wants to ask something, I think.
I was going to say, I agree with that, but I do think that maybe just means that we need to think about chamber tombs as a term in a different way. Because it seems the way, when you get down to that specific of a type of tomb, obviously, you usually think of a very specific thing. And that tends to happen with a lot of the way linguistics and the way we describe things is a big thing of mine. So this is a little maybe off topic, but the way we actually describe things in that way, they get so niched down into, like, we have an idea of what a chamber tomb is, and we've made it so narrow that we feel like these things have to compete rather than it just being a secondary descriptor.
Yeah, I mean, the language that we use is really important, and describing these as chamber tombs. Okay, Neil still likes the term chamber tomb, but you start comparing, it's like comparing, you know, apples and sausages, if actually these are two things that are fundamentally completely different. And we're still constrained by typological, you know, this has all come out of problems with typology, which in the first instance were really useful and helpful for us getting around regional variations, for us understanding the complexity of the archaeological record, but now seem to sort of hold us into some way, a particular way of approaching things. I mean, Neil's right. Things don't have to just be one thing. They can be multiple things. So perhaps I'm egging up that bit a little bit too much in this particular talk to try and make the point. But I think I do think that these are a fundamental different order than things like Clyde Cairns, Cotswold 7. If you look at those, if you visit those sites, things like the Clyde Cairns, they are lovely little stone boxes. They're incredibly practical for storing human remains. You flip off the lid, two people can move that lid out of the way, you can pop your human remains in there. It's all very, very straightforward. Dolmens, very, very different order of things, I think. But
I would agree with you. I think your point about typology being really constraining is very important, because that's something that it's one of the reasons I can't stand to study pottery or lithics, is because you get down to these typologies that end up being so narrow that you almost see the pattern everywhere because you want to see it everywhere. And I don't think that's irrelevant here, even if it's adjacent, because I think that's such an important point. I just wanted to agree with that.
Thank you.
Tim, did you want to say something?
Yeah, I just thanks, Vicky. That was good. I just want to say something about wonder and the idea of these things being to inspire wonder and it being an encounter. If we think that, then presumably we also think that wonder diminishes with familiarity, which raises the question of who was this aimed at? Who was meant to be getting the wondrous experience from them? Was it outsiders? Was it competitors, visitors, etc.? And is there any way of getting at that by looking at the location or something? I was just trying to sort of think of a testable hypothesis on the wonder side.
Yeah, who was experiencing?
They clearly are wonderful, and there's still amazing things to see. But if you lived there, and there were lots of them, and there clearly were very, very many more than there are today.
Yeah, it's a very good question. Who's going out and experiencing the wonder? I mean, we spent quite a lot of our time thinking about construction processes, and I've talked about that before, so I haven't really talked about that here today in case the other people, in case you had seen me talking about that. I wanted to do something new, and I think actually the act of construction was pretty critical as a social event for bringing people together, working, labouring together. This would have been a really dangerous thing to do. No health and safety in the early Neolithic there. Moving stones around that are, 50, 60, 70 tons in weight. We always used to joke at Garn-Turn, because of course it had fallen over, well, we're going to find somebody squashed underneath it where it had all gone horribly wrong. So actually you need to sponsor the building of the monument in the first place. But then I can only assume that if you've built it, you're not going to perhaps find it as wondrous because you know exactly how it's done. So perhaps it's aimed at somebody else. And with the current narratives on the start and spread of the Neolithic into Britain, this is all to play for, really. We do know that there are people coming in potentially in decent numbers from the continent. What are they up to? Why are they doing these things? And perhaps another question we should be asking ourselves is, why aren't they doing it everywhere? This isn't something that actually, there's no dolmens around me. This is something that in Britain actually really only takes place in Western Britain. This isn't relevant to those populations. So yeah, it asks and poses as many questions as perhaps it is. I think one of the great frustrations of dolmen studies, dolmening, is that there is very little material culture found from them. Pulnabrone stands out as the exception, and it's very, very frustrating with the lack of human remains from them. Perhaps we would be able to begin to answer some of those questions if there were more human remains excavated in the kinds of quantities that you get in, for example, the Cotswold 7 monuments, where you can do things like strontium isotope analysis and so on and so forth. But until we can find a decent, another decent haul of bodies in one of these things, which require more of these things being excavated, then I think at the moment we're still just going to have to sort of guess our way through how that might have played out in the early Neolithic.
But just in terms of their position in the landscape, they're not like where you're going to see them from a long distance, or where you're going to see them from a pathway or out at sea or anything in particular, are they? They're just
they're hidden away,
and so, often hidden. Yeah.
Or in some instances they are you have to walk towards them. So when you walk towards them, if you walk uphill, if they're on hills, you have to look up at them, which overemphasizes the size of them, the wondrous nature of them. But yes, I don't think these are designed or located to be widely seen.
Okay. Oh, Hannah wants to say something again.
Sorry, one second.
You want to say something, Hannah?
Sorry, the dog was coughing. I think there might be something comparable, ethnographically speaking, of how, if you are particularly religious, and if we're talking about wonder and this idea of something like a monument, especially if we're associating it with death or burial of any of that sort, I know that I have my Irish Catholic family that lives in New York. My aunt still goes giddy at walking into her church if it's a bright sunny day and you can see through the stained glass. And I think that just because you see something all the time is a bit of a quick disregard for how something that is commonplace in your life can still be wondrous. I mean, think of like walking by the Empire State Building or the London Eye every day. It's just you get used to it, but seeing it all lit up at night is still going to be pretty cool, even the 10th, 20th time. And so I think comparably, if there was a way to look at, if you were looking to do a comparison of, how could someone experience this wonder, that experience of something like my aunt walking into the same church every day for 40 bloody years and still getting that sense of wonder would be an interesting ethnographic comparison.
Yeah, I mean, maybe I'm underplaying how people got used to these things quite rapidly, but things do move on. they would have started perhaps not so much in these areas I'm talking about, but in other areas, hear tales of causewayed enclosures, hear tales of perhaps even more wondrous things. And, you know, things change, people move on. But yeah, perhaps they did continue to find them wondrous. The key thing here is that people nowadays go up to these sites and find them wonderful. So I don't see why they wouldn't have continued to do so in the Neolithic as well.
Okay. Any other questions? Because I have two questions. I was trying to think during your talk. I was trying to think of stones that might be bigger than the ones you showed us on these dolmens, and the one that occurred to me was the stone over the entranceway to the Treasury of Atreus, which is bigger than the ones you showed us, and it was clearly, again, part of the point is that it's a really big stone that leading into an entranceway to a structure that is both funerary and something else. So again, it's multi-purpose in the way that you've indicated. But though that type of architecture is called Cyclopean because in later times it was thought to have been built by giants. And it occurred to me that all these big stones lying around the ground might have been thought of as being the cast-offs of giants who had been there before people arrived. Has that thought occurred to you or Colin? Because you did use the A word, and I'm just trying to get away from the A word in terms of interpretation of these things.
Yeah, I mean, there was a few
Old giants' graves, aren't they?
yeah.
Old giants' graves.
Yeah, a lot of the names relate to mythological events like Bar Cloddy Adegaurus in Anglesey it's stones of an apron, somebody's apron, it translates as. But yeah, there's been lots of written about these landscapes as animate, and you know, them being thought of as the remains of ancestors. I mean, I know you hate that, but ancestral remains or mythological remains, that kind of thing. And I think that's okay. You know, I'm sure they interpreted the remains in some sort of way, but it's a bit generic. It doesn't really get us at the specifics of perhaps their worldview or their belief system. So yeah, and I think the other thing about sort of animate landscapes or mythological landscapes, particularly when you look at stone, is that there are ethnographic examples of stones that walk around, stones that move, stones that are people, stones that come to life, but they don't come to life all the time. It's only at particular key crunch points that they're animate and that they're part of that understanding. So yeah, I think we've thought about it, lots of people have written about it, but in quite a sort of a generic way, not particularly helpful.
Okay, yes. And my second question, thank you for that, Vicki. My second question was, you talked about them being reanimated much later in the Bronze Age.
Yeah.
But you talked about there being some notion of descent connecting their erection at some point in the Neolithic, you said the early Neolithic, to some point in the Bronze Age. By my calculations, that's 1,500 years. Yeah. So would the people in the Bronze Age have had accurate knowledge via some oral tradition of what was going on in the Neolithic, or might they have reinterpreted them in an entirely different way that bears little relation to their original meaning?
Possibly either or. I think we tend to think it's such a large period of time has passed that they probably didn't have the first clue as to what these things were originally built about. And yet, when you go and you investigate these things, we were chatting to Neil before the talk started. We're excavating a chamber tomb up in Orkney at the moment, which had a lot of Bronze Age reuse in it. And they went into that monument and they very carefully removed the backfill. They went to the big upstanding orthostats. They knew exactly where they were going in that monument. They extracted them. They put the backfill back in, and then they created turned those orthostats into a Bronze Age kist. And that suggests that they had knowledge of what that site was like. It wasn't just, oh, there's a chambered tomb, we've got no idea what it was. They knew what they were dealing with. They knew where things were. Now, whether that's precisely how it was in they knew exactly which descent groups were there from the early Neolithic, but there does seem to be considerable knowledge, long-term knowledge being passed down. Now, that might not be the case in every area, particularly again when we've got this new DNA evidence that indicates perhaps people coming in perhaps considerable numbers at the start of the Bronze Age. Again, it's a really, really interesting question. I don't have the answer.
I thought they would have gone through phases when they were exploring those monuments. So they could not have had a continuity, but they could have learnt about them by going in and exploring them. And certainly, you know, I would have thought it might be because of the possible disjunction in population that's a possibility. They actually set out to look at those monuments to understand them. And some of them would have been upstanding, and you know, you probably could have got into some that were relatively complete, and then others would have collapsed and fallen down, and they wouldn't have been in anything like the same kind of way.
Yeah, I agree.
Okay, other questions? Final question? Because I think it's almost 1:30. We've had quite a discussion here because it's been a very interesting paper, which has lots of implications and resonances. Any final question? No final question. In that case, it remains, we've already thanked her, but just thank Vicki again.
Thank you.
And to say that next week we have another Cardiff graduate on a completely different topic, Alice Forward, talking about material expression of lordship and loyalty in 13th century Glamorgan. So much closer to home in some respects than this wonderful talk that Vicki has given us. But thank you very much, Vicki, for visiting us virtually through the magic of technology.
Lovely to see you all.
Yeah.
So, and hope to see you all next week.
Hope to see you in Orkney next summer.
Yes, come and visit our excavation, Neil. We're delighted to see you.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye.